Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Can, Head of Mining Journal Research, and this is one of 3 online discussions we're running as part of our stakeholder engagement program. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists for this session. We've got Niels Wage from Danakali, CEO, Evgeny Monakov, who is the Head of Investor Relations with Polymetal. We've got Georgina Hallett, Chief Sustainability Officer with the London Metal Exchange, Carl Lomnitz, Senior Investment Manager with Janus Henderson Investors, and finally John Mulligan, who is Director and Market Relations and Climate Change Lead with the World Gold Council. Welcome everyone. We'd like to get started with a common complaint that we get from the industry. We always have several stakeholders here and industry groups, but from an industry perspective, there are a huge number of standards that companies are asked to comply with these days and keep up with. We've got 2 groups that have their own standards that they've issued and guidelines, the World Gold Council, represented by John, and the London Metal Exchange, obviously an intermediary, represented by Georgina. John, I'd just like to start by asking, how important is it for you when you're developing these standards and these guidelines for you to align with other groups that are doing similar things, like the ICMM or IRMA, to make sure that we try and limit the confusion that's out there for mining companies?
Thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all. So when we formulated the Responsible Gold Mining Principles, which is the set of standards we're talking about, we were very mindful that there were already a number of industry standards, a number of relevant guidance to miners and to other supply chain participants. So the question was, why would we do it first of all? And there are some issues that are specific to gold, but also the way that the gold supply chain was evolving was to ensure that there were these responsible standards and guidance transparently being developed to allow a broad set of stakeholders to understand what a responsible supply chain looked like. And what that meant was the Responsible Gold Mining Principles would allow miners to demonstrate what responsible gold mining was in practice, independently verified, but that would then plug into another set of standards, or a compatible set, shall we say, at the point of the refinery, and that's a set of standards that we call the Enhanced Responsible Gold Guidance, of the LBMA, and then that might then flow into or interlink with a set of standards downstream. So it was important that we basically had a coherent set of standards that interlinked across the whole gold supply chain. Now, we did so when we started on that principle. The question was, okay, and it comes straight to the point of your question, how do we do that in a way which basically minimizes the burden on business? The idea of compliance fatigue, the idea of, okay, well, as you say, why do I have to fill something in X number of times? This conversation is ongoing, but the big question is one of equivalency. Basically, if I ask somebody to perform on one standard, can I then say they are compliant with another standard? And that is the conversation that we're having. So we didn't develop anything in isolation. We were very, very mindful of something like the ICMM, Mining with Principles performance expectations. We have shared members, so we don't want them to come back to us and say, why do we have to do this multiple times? We have conversed and discussed, and are still doing so, with the Minerals Association of Canada to talk about their TSM framework. As you mentioned, there are a lot of these things around. I think the direction of travel, however, is one of, as I say, equivalence, down the line, some degree of harmonization, certainly mutual recognition, which will allow you to perform once, but then speak to many standards. And I think that is absolutely key. And it isn't only prevalent, or the direction of travel, in mining. Within the whole climate reporting sector, this is also the direction of travel. The idea being, what does it mean to report against TCFD if I already report against GRI, etc. And I could, the number of acronyms we could just list in terms of what emerging standards mean in the ESG space. I think that is the direction of travel, is harmonization. And before I let somebody else speak, I think it's key that I noticed just this week, reading about activities over the last month or so, that everybody is mindful of the need to converge and harmonize ESG standards. And I think that the IOSCO announced at the end of September that the CEOs of CDP, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDSB, Carbon Disclosure Standards Board, SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, etc. 5 of the main frameworks are now going to work together to try and harmonize the ESG reporting environment. So I think the direction of travel is there. Everybody realizes that equivalency, mutual recognition needs to happen, and needs to happen quite soon.
So if they're harmonizing, John, does that mean that we'll do away with a whole bunch of standards that are out there, or does it mean, will there still be a discrete place for things like the World Gold Council's principles, copper mark? I know the aluminium industry has its own set of standards. Are there things that fall outside this harmonized collective of standards that will still need to be picked up by individual industry?
It's a good question. I think that it goes back to what is the standard for. So you mentioned copper mark and the idea of what responsible aluminium might look like, and etc. And there's a slightly different question there regarding what a standard is for. If a standard is to allow something to be branded as a responsible product, that is a slightly different motivation than being able to prove responsible business to the wider set of stakeholders. So, and because of that, there will undoubtedly be niche standards for particular purposes. I think when I say harmonization, that's down the road. First of all, we need to actually understand, and I think it's a long way to go, what, as I say, what some of this disclosure and performance metrics, what are they for? Within the climate space, and I generally have a tendency to bring things back to climate at the moment. In the climate space, there's a big question around what industries are reporting, what mining is reporting, what it's disclosing, and what investors expect or what regulators expect. And there's still a, dare I say it, an understanding gap, an information gap about what something is needed for, what is the metric, what is the data for. And I think until we bridge that gap, harmonization remains down the road.
Okay, Georgina, same question for you. Obviously, you're coming at it from a slightly different perspective. You're in the middle of the market. You have people to align with downstream and upstream. How important is that process for you? Do you look at it from very much your immediate user's perspective, or do you take a more holistic view when you're putting these together?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think it sounds like we've been through a very similar process as John has at the World Gold Council. We had a huge debate at the beginning of our responsible sourcing work to say, should the LME be producing its own standard? And the challenge that we had was, one, we didn't want to add to the proliferation of standards that are already out there, versus the fact that we're talking about more than one metal. We have 7 metals, or 9 if you include both the aluminium alloys contracts. And there is value for people producing more than one metal to be able to use one standard to meet all the requirements, rather than having to do the same piece of work 3 times for the per metal standards. So that was the big debate for us. We came to the same conclusion, that the LME adding to that proliferation wasn't helpful. And just as a reference, we had done a survey with our brands in 17, asking for information on the work they already did. And then I typed up a list as the responses came in of all the different sort of requirements, standards, guidelines they met. And I got to 4 typed pages of bullet points of all out there, local, regional, international, and so on. So we didn't want to add to that. So we took the decision to base our requirements on the OECD due diligence guidance, which felt like it was very well established in the market. LBMA had already used it for the gold, and indeed our gold settlement process is run by them, so it made sense to align. in the EU conflict minerals regulation is also premised on the OECD. So it felt like there was a great take up of that. It was becoming a sort of centralized set of guidance that people could really get behind. And it fitted with the scope that we wanted to meet, which was very much focused on the conflict minerals piece, human rights, and so on. So that felt like a relatively straightforward decision, having been through that debate. And actually, it's been very well received by the market. The challenge is then that there weren't standards for all the metals that we needed to cover. Obviously, tin had been caught by Dodd-Frank, so that they were well established. Cobalt has been focused for a long time, so they were well established. But for some metals like lead and zinc, for example, we were starting from square one. And actually, one of the great outcomes has been that the copper mark, which was started by the International Copper Association and are now split out, they are producing a multi-metal due diligence standard to cover copper, lead, nickel, and zinc. So those producers can use one standard if they are producing more than one of those metals. But I absolutely agree with what John said. The key is cross-recognition, so that you don't have to keep producing the same piece of work over and over again for all the different requirements. We've had, for example, initial conversations with the Responsible Steel Initiative. So steel isn't one of our physically settled metals, so it doesn't come under our remit, but they obviously use a lot of metals for alloying, and we want them to be able to recognize LME branded metals for the work they've already done, so that those metals don't have to do that same piece of work for responsible steel as well. And they're very supportive of that. And I think generally the industry now is fully aware of this need to cross-recognize so that we're not overloading everyone. I mean, the Copper Mark, for example, have done great work in building equivalency into their standard so that people can use or on-site audits, for example, to meet that section of a requirement. So I agree, lots more work to do here, but I think that the need is fully understood, which it perhaps wasn't a couple of years ago. I think if we're all pushing in that direction, we will make good progress.
Good. Georgina, you mentioned IRMA, you also mentioned responsible steel, which I know prefers IRMA. From your perspective, with the direction of travel for the LME guidelines as they stand, can you see yourselves preferring mining groups to start taking on an IRMA style certification, or are the slightly less rigorous standards or guidelines, do you think they're always going to be okay because they're more, as long as it's performance driven, then you'll be satisfied?
I think, well, we set very clear requirements for what we want in terms of responsible sourcing. And I think as long as the standard you're using meets those requirements, we are relaxed about whether that's through a certification and accreditation and audit and assurance. I mean, you can get really locked into that technical debate. The standards that people use for us have to have been through an alignment assessment process with the OECD guidance, and if that's all been met, then we're fine. That's our sort of our audit piece for checking equivalence. But there are lots out there, and we are very keen to make sure that people aren't doing, an on-site audit 3 times for the different standards they have to do, and then 3 times again for the different metals, because that's clearly just ridiculous and is not a good use of anyone's time or resources. So yeah, as long as they've been alignment assessed, then we're happy.
Okay, Evgeny, if I can come to you next, from a miner's perspective, what would you like to see? You're obviously, you have multiple sites, you're a large producer, you're doing a lot of reporting. What would you like to see from the standards landscape? How would you like to see it evolve?
Well, I think hi, thank you for your question. I think the previous speakers have laid it out perfectly for me. As a large gold and silver producer, a mining company with operations in 2 countries with 9 mine sites, quite a substantial amount of people involved in mining these sites. What we would like to see is uniformity and predictability of the standards involvement. And of course, with uniformity, hopefully a reduction in number of standards or reporting schemes that we are adhering to or complying with right now. We feel that this is not the best use of our sort of sustainability team's time when they sit and decide which standard they should follow, or which are the priority for them to follow. When you have a whole industry of consultants and advisors whose whole job is to make sense of this alphabet soup of reporting standards and principles, it's clearly a sign of trouble that you need to sort out, in our view, as soon as possible, because I think the resources are being diverted away from the important issues towards the issues which are probably less important, deciding which acronym to follow.
Sure. And you suggested there's an element of urgency there again. I mean, how much, can you give us an idea of how much time your sustainability team is spending on administration and reporting versus how much time it gets to put into its programs?
Well, if you listen to them, the bulk of their time is spent on compliance and with filling out questionnaires and ticking the boxes and going through the massive spreadsheets that are being sent on a weekly basis to go through all these things. It's important. I don't want to disparage any of these things. It's important. We need to disclose things that we're doing. We need to disclose the extent to which we're altering the environment when we do what we do. However, a lot of time is spent on redundant things, we feel, at the moment. And we appreciate it's a complex issue. I mean, we would like to have some sort of like a international, accounting standards, conventional approach to these things. But we understand that the ESG is a very complex sort of confluence of issues, and they probably can't be reduced just to numbers that quickly and that efficiently. Although, I mean, our desire is, of course, for a quick, bringing them to a common denominator, if you like.
Okay. Niels, how does that sound from your perspective? Obviously, you're developing a mine. You don't have the capacity necessarily for the admin, the group the size of Polymetal has the capacity for, and they're struggling. How do you guys cope with what you're being asked of? And are you being asked the same? Does it sound like you're being asked for the same level of disclosure and reporting and compliance?
Yeah, there's different stages in development, but clearly we want to be ahead of the game, where we are not in operations yet, we're not building yet, but we're in development. So we engage early with groups like this and the previous speakers. I think they hit it on a nail for us that we need to make a decision which standards we're going to follow. We have limited financial resources, we have limited people available to do this. Obviously, we can put a lot of consultants in place, but that's also not where you want to spend your money necessarily. So to have a standard there that is worldwide recognized by all the stakeholders is extremely important for us. And so we are in a sense following what the big companies are doing and the big companies and the councils are pushing for. But we want to be leading in the small space where we want to set the right example of adopting these standards early. We have the opportunity to put our management systems in place according to these standards. So we are, in a way, we want to contribute to that discussion where we can, because we are still in the development stage, and we can make sure that we have the systems, management systems, the people in place to comply and to get the right performance, because that's the overall goal. And I think that's something that we shouldn't take out of sight, that the overall goal is to have the right thing that you want to do to the world, to your communities, to all your stakeholders. And it's not a tick in the box and having a certificate.
Okay, so from your perspective, it sounds like you're not facing the same kind of pressures because you're not operational yet, but your advice would be to make sure that you're putting all the pieces in place so you can face those kind of pressures as you grow, doing that as early as possible, as opposed to waiting and then scrambling.
Exactly right. But there's actually, when we're talking to investors, they have clearly their standards. They have their expectations. When we talk to communities, we have our responsibilities. They have their expectations. So there's a lot of that work already happening. But the reporting it really starts when you actually get an operation, where we think that we can do early reporting and be transparent on how we're going to do things, and that would help us to get the right systems in place.
Okay. In a moment, I'd like to bring Tal in as our investor sitting with us today, specifically on reporting and what he'd like to see there. But before we do that, and Tal, very welcome to jump in on this as well, I would like to put you all on the hot seat and just get an idea from your perspective, not necessarily what your individual organisations are targeting, but perhaps what you'd like to broadly see, or the direction you're heading, and where you'd like the industry as a whole to be in terms of the standards landscape in say 24 months and then a little bit further out. And John, if I can go full circle and come back to you to start with.
Well, it's quite simple in some ways, because the Responsible Gold Mining Principles, which were launched September last year, have a 3-year kind of development cycle in terms of when they will be reported against. And if you consider that the World Gold Council's membership now represents around, I think, about 56% of all corporate gold production, and there are, quite strikingly and importantly, the members have agreed that that is it's the part of the mandate of the organization, and their membership are tied together with performance on those principles. That basically we would therefore expect within 2 years to see progress against the principles, and then the following year to see what has been reported. So it's for us quite simple. The principles are in place. They have been agreed. There are commitments to them. What does progress start to look like? And so within 2 years we should have a good picture on that. In 3 years we should have some clear demonstrable evidence. So that's kind of one simple answer. The other aspect, I think you didn't say 5 years, but can I jump in on that now? One of the things I think that would be an aspiration is that many of the legacy perceptions that come with talking about mining more generally start to be put behind the sector, because it has been seen to be demonstrably, shall we say, progressive in many aspects. And also it is a changed industry. It is no longer the industry that people think about when they think about mining from 15, 20, 30 years ago. There are always going to be very significant challenges, but I think how the whole sector tells its story, how wider society perceives it, if this was a 5-year aspiration, I think you would not have, if you like, somebody willing to engage with the tech sector, but then turn away from the mining sector, which you still do, certainly with some investors. I think if we can put that behind us, we've come a long way.
And what about, and I know you've got an agreement in terms of alignment and convergence with the ICMM, or I think you have got an agreement. Do you expect that process to be mature in terms of aggregating and aligning these standards, or do you see that as a much longer term objective?
We have a published equivalency, which we are ready to publish. The ICMM, because of the range of stakeholders and the number of metals they're covering, somewhat like Georgina, have to cover an awful lot. So their equivalency table is a lot more complex than ours in terms of where we are aligned. We have done the analysis, we're ready to publish it. We're fairly comfortable that, substantially, 70-80% were compatible in terms of a performance standard. But ours, and we should point out that it's not a membership standard for us. This is something we want the whole gold sector to embrace, all gold mining companies. We want this to move the industry forward. But nonetheless, to go back to your question about the ICMM, we would certainly hope that that would be fairly clear, and the equivalency would then be clear and actually implemented in practice.
Okay, Georgina, I know that your standards and your guidelines are still evolving as we speak. What does it look like for you in a couple of years for the LME rules, but also how they dovetail up and downstream?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to get John to speak on behalf of the LME going forward, because it's a very similar story again. Our rules are all in place. They're in the rule book, and for our listed brands, it's not voluntary. in order to continue being a listed brand, which means that your metal can be used to settle an LME contract, they have to meet our responsible sourcing requirements. So those start to, they bite now, but we start seeing reporting in 2022. So that will be the next big deadline for us. And, that will be the crunch point. If brands haven't done the work, we will start having to delist people. So our big priority is ensuring that we get as many of our brands over the line as possible, because this isn't about us getting to have a bonfire of brands in June 2022. This is about everyone getting to that standard, and the LME needs to work as hard as possible to speaking to each brand individually to make sure they're understanding what the rules are and that they're doing the work. The next big thing for us, I guess, after that, and we've committed to not changing the rules regularly, because it's not fair on people who are trying to implement it to keep moving the goalposts. But clearly, since we started work on this in 2017, the sustainability debate has got much broader, and I think the next step is clearly going to have to be the incorporation of some kind of environmental targets in there. We're doing other work on the side in the interim, and a big piece of that is transparency, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But so that will be the next big challenge for our non-voluntary requirements is what the next sort of iteration, what phase 2 looks like, what gets included at that point. And yeah, to your point about upstream and downstream, as much as we can do to recognize those and to allow those to be recognized in meeting our requirements, the more value we add.
Okay, Evgeny, what would you like to see from your perspective? Obviously, you'd like to see less time spent on admin. What do you think is realistic? What do you need to see in over a 2-year time frame?
Well, 2 years, hopefully a reduction in the alphabet soup of standards and various reporting sort of frameworks that we are following. It's a very complex industry, and I fully appreciate that these, quite complex relationships with the outside world are being just put into numbers, which are put into the spreadsheets. But I hope that some sort of standardization takes place, and we at least see a stop to proliferation of new standards, because right now what we're seeing almost every month, something new, completely new acronym pops up. And our sustainability team, including investor relations team, we spend time in trying to understand the implications of that appearance and what that mean for us as someone who's trying to be as transparent and as upfront with the stakeholders about what we do.
Okay, I'm going to push you a little bit harder getting on that. Same with John. Maybe not saying exactly what it will look like, but do you hope that process will be fairly mature, that convergence of standards and that landscape will be a lot tighter or easier for groups such as Polymetal to navigate, or do you have a tolerance for a slightly longer term view?
We are definitely prepared and equipped to sort of put up with the current state of affairs. That's how we have been managing and building our sustainability team to meet the challenge of the ever-growing demand for information from us. Are we optimistic? I think internally we're not optimistic that it's going to change. We realize that this is an industry with a lot of interested parties, invested interests, and each will fight its corner quite viciously to have their standards upheld. We feel that it will take some sort of almost like a national intervention at a regulator level to make use, to make this uniform.
Okay. Tal, you've been very patient in the background there. Did you want to talk about standards, or can I ask you about reporting straight off the bat?
I'll sort of dive in and just sort of talk standards into reporting, if that's okay.
Sure. Okay.
I guess by way of background, we invest the hard-earned money of our clients, and our objective is to generate the best returns we can and take controlled risk. And for years, we've been frustrated by lack of data availability to help us make those decisions. And we've been banging on about improving disclosure, and all our engagement has been directed at that. And that's changed a lot now. There is a lot of data. There are a lot of standards, as all the other participants on this panel have alluded to. And that is now the source of frustration. So where we are now, to some extent, is a much better place than we were at. And I think we should recognize that. Having said that, all of these standards do need standardization. And I wouldn't argue with that point at all. I think Evgeny's point about it only really going to come to bear when there's a big stick and people are told to do it is likely. There's one of two things. There's either you're forced to do something that's expensive and difficult and perhaps a little bit irritating to do, or there's money in it. And to that extent, I think what the LME is doing is very important. If the metal that a miner produces cannot be sold or purchased through the LME, that will become a very big stick. It's both a stick and a carrot in a way. And so I think that is sort of a very interesting evolution. With the best will in the world, a lot of the sort of voluntary organizations where standards get put together, whether that's in a sense the ICMM or the World Gold Council, I don't see where the stick there lies, really. So I'm just wondering, I think standards are great to be putting out there, but just by way of example, after Vale's terrible 2 incidents in the last several years, they didn't get kicked out of the ICMM. So I'm sort of wondering where these standards really have teeth when they are part of a voluntary organization that lives and breathes by virtue of the number of members it has, which improves, enhances its weight and credibility in many ways. There seems to be a reluctance to kick people out that don't uphold these standards, which gets me to the most sort of interesting bit of this, I think, is this will only really come to bear when it becomes a mandatory reporting function, probably something that finds its way into the annual reports and accounts of companies when they're published. At the moment, what we see is that a lot of the sort of non-financial information is sitting in the front part of the annual report, or it's sitting in a separate sustainability report. And what I would really like to see is that information moving into the back half of the annual report, where it is a number, it's measured, it's objective, it's audited. And in that way, we can start to compare. Now, what we'll lose there is the intricacies, different metals, different important factors that we need to consider. And I appreciate that mine by mine, this is going to look different from how it looks at the corporate level. But we have to start somewhere. And so what I'd like to see in terms of reporting is consistency, standardization, quantitative data that is audited and mandatory to report.
Okay, just want to jump back to Niels if I can for a moment. Firstly, Niels, on I actually neglected to get your 2-year view. If I could do that very quickly, and then secondly, on what Tal was saying there on reporting in that way, what difference would that make to you as a junior company? Would that make a big difference, or as you're in development, will that not have a huge impact as yet?
I think it would help us to actually. I mean, everybody is trying to put their best foot forward in reporting. I think a standardization and what a very important stakeholder, like an investor, a shareholder, requires is extremely important. And clearly, what you hear, shareholders, they listen to the public, they listen to what's going on in society. So I think that's a good representation. So I think having standards there, which are consistent, transparent, quantitative, and standardized, is very good for us, because it will help us to build the company and the reporting that is required. And then it's also clear what is important to our stakeholders. So I think I would be a big supporter there. At the same token, with my 2-year view, I mean, seeing the amount of different stakeholders and the amount of different, I mean, you have mining, but we're also in the fertilizer industry, and we're also in a finance world. So there's a number of collaborations needed to get that standardization. So I think you need what we have seen now on World Bank standards. I think on the UN, those are probably the bodies that are required. But I think a mandatory push would be welcome from our perspective.
Okay, Tal, I know you've previously talked about international accounting standards and how that's done. Evgeny alluded to the fact earlier that may not be practical. Can you give us a sense of how you would actually see it working?
So I'm very happy to see that a lot of the groups that we've been talking about, SASB, IRC, CDP, GRI, that alphabet soup, are sort of consolidating their views and coming up with harmonized standards. I mean, I happen to be quite a big fan of what the SASB have been doing. I kind of like their reporting standards. The disclosure topics are appropriate. I think the accounting metrics are appropriate. The way that pretty much all of the measures are objective, quantitative, and measurable. As I said, they are a little bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut in some ways, but I think that's a very good starting point. What would need to happen there is you'd have to see the SASB, which is sort of an independent, non-government affiliated body, absorbed into something like the Financial Accounting Standards Board, in order for those standards to become mandatory reporting. Now, of course, it's only going to capture listed companies, but I think once you start there, it flows down the food chain, because which listed company will look to acquire a medium-sized or a small company that doesn't follow these standards? So I think it will naturally flow down the chain and become much more significant. The other thing to consider is what's coming in middle of next year, which is the non-financial reporting directive out of the European Union. That's going to be tremendously important in terms of creating not just the stick, but the carrot in a way. I'm always reminded of that phrase out of Jerry Maguire, "Show me the money." And, you know, in this case, it's going to be the $1 trillion that's expected to be spent over the next 10 years as the European Union looks to decarbonize and do all those wonderful things that are going to need a lot of copper, lithium, cobalt, nickel, iron ore. The list goes on. But for for mining companies' product to be included in that investment package, there are going to need to be certain non-financial reporting measures that are put in place. So I think it's going to be the combination of those, and it might actually come a little bit sooner than people think, because this directive is coming, as I say, middle of next year.
Okay, so you would see it following immediately on the back of that kind of thing, or do you mean you'll see there'll be a bit of a fallout from that, and then people will start to work towards a revised reporting standard?
I suspect that will create an impetus and a pull from companies to almost ask for these to become mandatory, so that they can then go to investors, insurance companies, banks, and so on, and show that they have these objective, whatever they are, in place. You know, whether it's your greenhouse gas emissions, exactly how those are measured, your air quality, your energy management, your water management, your hazardous material management, and so on. Again, all measured. You know, it falls to me to ask companies, have they been fined at all for breaching any hazardous material standards or had any hazardous spills? A lot of that isn't easy to find. And I know the data is out there, but you know, I've got 70 companies in my portfolio out of an investable universe of 300, out of a total universe of 5 to 10,000. You know, it's impossible for me to go and dig all this out. It has to be put into the annual report so that it can then be consolidated up into data vendors like a Bloomberg. Every fund manager in the world has got a Bloomberg terminal. As soon as it's in there, it'll be everywhere.
Okay, Evgeny, you can see you nodding along sometimes in your little box up in the corner there. Which parts of that could you immediately think, yes, that's something that we could get on board with, that would help us? Which bits do you think that might not work so well? And which bits can you say, look, I like that, but that's going to be more of a challenge?
Well, I actually I completely go along with pretty much everything that Tal has had to say. At the end of the day, these complex issues have been already sort of boiled down into the numbers that can be put in a spreadsheet and compared across the industries, across the countries. So it's not the first challenge that the community of financiers and mining specialists face in terms of reporting something. It's a complex issue, but I'm pretty sure that it can be sorted out, so it can be put in a spreadsheet and compared and objectively verified and audited, like Tal says. We would welcome any shape of incentive, be it coercion or be it a more softer sort of carrot-like incentive. We are hopefully prepared for any outcome, and I think Tal is absolutely correct. Once there is a system of both a punishment for not complying and an incentive to comply in terms of lower cost of capital, then you'll see the change, which is going to be quite rapid. Because right now, in the absence of the incentives, it's just more of a, if you like, a goodwill or feel-good sentiment among the boards or the management teams. With the absence of these incentives, this process can take years and years and years, and I think it's not sustainable the way it has been mushrooming. Okay,
what kind of time frame do you think it's achievable in? I think Tal's talking. He's pretty optimistic that people will need it, people want it, they'll be asking for it, demanding it in a fairly short space of time. What kind of time frame would you like to see something?
We hope that one part of the world adopts it and it works well, and it works in favor of investors, mining companies, and other sort of stakeholders, regulators. So it just takes, I think, one place where it works, and then everybody will, we think, jump on the bandwagon and try to copy it. So 3 years is not an amount of time we would put. We would think it's not possible.
Okay, Tal, your head's about to fall off your shoulders. There, you're nodding. So,
I was just sort of thinking, it's only going to take a few companies to put together some sort of financing advantage, and that word cost of capital that Evgeny mentioned, I think, is going to be quite important. I mean, did we think 2 years ago that we'd see BP tell us that they were going to wind down their oil business and reorient towards a completely new energy type of construct? Probably not. Arguably, that's happened a lot more quickly than anyone anticipated because they've seen their cost of capital explode. So, you could argue that if that's the case, maybe it's just because the oil price dropped to $40. But, I suspect 2 years ago, they would have just told us that they see the oil price going back up to 60 or 70 and everything will be fine. They haven't done that. They're changing their business model. So, I'm not quite sure what's tipped that balance so much more quickly than I would have expected 2 years ago. But I think what will happen is, you need a few successes of companies that look to, win some financing, get new projects constructed with a lower cost of capital because they commit to measuring and performing on certain criteria. And that'll really get the eyes of the executive suite focused on it. The CFO will be talking about it. He'll be talking about where the money comes from and how cheap it is. And that'll be, I think, probably what gets things motoring.
Okay. A lot of the conversations that we're hearing around reporting come back to transparency. Georgina, from your perspective as someone who owns a standard, How important is that? And I guess the data availability that Tal was talking about, how important is that in improving overall standards and having that transparency installed?
Yeah, it's absolutely essential. I mean, if you talk to the civil society organisations, they'd say don't bother with the standard, just make everyone report every year, and they will effectively be peer pressured into making improvements year on year, because it will all be obvious to people if they're not making good on the commitments they've made. But I absolutely agree with Tal. The issue at the moment is that even people who are reporting, it's going into their CSR report on page 60, and no one's got the time to go and individually look up every single CSR report and find the data they need. So we've actually been working on a platform to try and address this, to the carrot end of this debate, where people can put up their metal and be transparent about the sustainability metrics that they're hitting, whatever they are. So we're not setting thresholds for inclusion with the idea that we're trying to encourage people to come along with us. We're going to say, just be transparent about your sustainability work you're doing, put up the independent verification that you've done so that people know you're telling the truth. And then that information is all in one central place, open to everyone to have a look at. And suddenly that information is so much more accessible. And then to the realizing the value of that, which I totally agree is a crucial incentive, it will be sort of twinned with a spot trading platform, which work, a little bit like eBay, an online auction style platform where you can go on and search for metal that meets the sustainability criteria that you're interested in. And, likewise for people who own metal, to put their metal up and really be loud and proud about all the great work that metal has met, all the great standards that metal has met. And suddenly, that combination of standards and transparency has real power, because it's available to everyone and people can realize financial value for it. And you've got a whole market there, and you can use that to really work out what sustainability metrics people are really interested in and do further development for products on that basis as well. So we hope that will be a really powerful tool for generating change, because suddenly it's all centralized in a way that it isn't at the moment.
Okay, John, is a similar approach and similar value you see in terms of use of data and transparency with the principles for the
So the transparency aspect of the principles were key from the start, and we learned from our conflict-free gold standard, which was an operationalization of the OECD due diligence principles, that one of the things that was needed was clarity on what is being requested of the independent assurer. And it's been mentioned before that you get a lot of consultancies in this space, a lot of people saying we can validate X, Y, and Z. What we've spent a lot of time this time doing, because we're talking now about 51 potential different performance metrics, not all of which can be measured, so not all of them have a hard number or attached to them, but those that can be measured we expect to be. And what we've said is we've documented, we've produced an adherence framework document to go with the principles, to say, well, this actually is what adherence looks like. This is what people can expect you to be reporting on. And then we've also produced an assurer's document to say to those people who are coming in to assure against performance that this is what's expected of them. And those documents, that guidance, is basically to allow other stakeholders to view performance, demonstrations of performance from the outside. So it's not just numbers, it's not just a spreadsheet, it is the ability for people to judge for themselves what performance against those particular metrics are. And that's where we see transparency going. And just to comment on the question of this being a voluntary standard, it is voluntary in the sense that, well, if you're a member, it's mandatory, but if you choose to adhere to it, it's voluntary, except when you go to your refiner. If that refiner is a good delivery refiner, they may well ask you to show how you're demonstrating those principles, how your responsible business is demonstrating that it is adhering to those principles. And that basically means that if you want to be part of the global pool liquidity for your product, you need to be performing against those principles. And that's the way we see both transparency and that carrot and stick working that was mentioned earlier.
It does feel like there's a lot of that. The downstream market is demanding a certain standard, and although the mining industry's guidelines and standards are largely voluntary, they need to be adhered to. Otherwise, the non-voluntary ones further down the stream are going to stop them in their tracks.
Yeah, and I think that's so. Everybody has presumably engaged with some of those downstream participants that are basically saying we will turn away from newly mined product and only deal with recycled product because we don't want to inherit the risks and the legacy impacts, if you like. I think that's if you can't re-engage with that downstream and say actually there are beneficial impacts in terms of this supply chain and you are freezing them out, I think you need to be able to engage with something solid, and that's what these type of principles and the transparency aspect in reporting on them should allow upstream participants to do.
One other thing that occurs to me as everyone's talking is a lot of what we're talking about, feels to me, is assuring the ultimate consumer of the particular commodity in question that no damage has been done in the production of that commodity. I think there is also another angle to this which doesn't get talked about, which is how much good is done in the production of that commodity. Yes. And I feel the industry across the board, I don't know how it can happen, because there's a sort of a principal agent problem here, there's a coat riding problem, but if the mining industry at large made more effort to disclose all of the good that comes out of it, whether it's trickled down at the local level, taxes paid, national income, number of wind turbines built, number of solar panels built, the amount of copper that's gone into connecting all these together, I think that would go a long way towards improving the overall image of the industry to the benefit of all.
Sorry, can I just jump in quickly? That's exactly, very quickly, that's exactly what I meant about that 5-year aspiration of removing some of the legacy issues, because I agree entirely the industry, and gold mining in particular, has not been that skilled at telling that story and talking about the socio-economic benefits of the supply chain. So I agree entirely. Sorry, I won't.
Yeah, no, John, it's a consistent theme. We've heard it in all the panels so far, and I think we've heard it for years. Mining is terrible at publicising itself. I think we're used to basically hiding in the corner and protecting ourselves from people throwing stones, or the horrible things we've done. So there's more of an effort to be made there for sure. I did, before we move on to that culture piece that I wanted to talk about, I'm just conscious that Georgina's the furthest downstream we have on the panel, and I was quite keen to get your thoughts, Georgina, on that, I guess, that flow of standards versus carrot and stick as we move from the mining industry down to the end consumer.
Yeah, and it's a messy picture, right? Because the end consumer is what a person like anyone on this panel, an individual, but more often in the mining industry, when we talk about consumers, we're really talking about fabricators, i.e. the people who make something out of the metal that then goes to the end consumer. And I think that's probably where a real power base lies, because they tend to be quite big corporations with a lot of buying power, and they really have the ability to impose their demands on the upstream. Which they're doing, right? The Global Battery Alliance, for example, is a group of stakeholders that involves that group who are working to ensure that the supply chain for battery minerals is meeting the requirements which they absolutely expect to see at the sort of automotive, for example, level. So the demand is there. I think at the moment it is carrot, but I think it will quickly move into stick if they don't see the results they expect to see. And the further upstream you go, the more you have to be aware of that. The tricky side is at the moment, and this is anecdotal only, but the producers aren't seeing a premium for metal that has been produced sustainably. And again, it's difficult to say that because sustainability means different things to different people. But there isn't a premium at the moment, and arguably there shouldn't be, right? I've heard arguments that sustainably produced metal should be cheaper in order to incentivize the demand for it. But it's a lot of work. I mean, we've all been very on the same page in terms of what we're trying to get to and the path to get there, but we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is to actually do that, how much money is involved, the cost, the effort, the resource. And even if you're measuring, say, emissions for aluminium. There's still so many different ways you can do that. So getting consistency is tough. So it's not just a straightforward producers need to do this work and they'll see the benefits, because that linear path isn't entirely obvious at the moment. But I do think the mining opportunity has a huge, the mining industry has a huge opportunity here. Metals are absolutely essential for the sustainable transition. They, the clean technology, solar powers, wind farm, etc., all so much more metal dependent. If the mining industry, and this goes to your point about culture, the mining industry doesn't take advantage of this moment to really, show its face, show all the great work it's doing and all the great work it's continuing to do and wants to develop into, then we have massively missed that opportunity to change the image of mining internationally.
So on the culture issue, and I think also going back to John and Tal's point on the reputation issue of the industry and selling the mining industry, selling itself a little bit better. One of the things that we can talk about today, because this is the last conversation that we're having of the three, the point that's been brought up consistently is that it's a cultural shift going on. So a lot of the things we're talking about are going to be produced in hard numbers. They're going to be seen through reporting changes, but it's a cultural shift. It's representative of a cultural shift in the industry. And I think few would deny that that's actually happening. It happened probably over 10 to 15 years and accelerated over the last couple of years. Yet over the past couple of years, we've also seen some of the most horrific discrepancies, to put it lightly, that the industry's potentially been guilty of, with Juukan Gorge recently, and obviously Brumadinho and Samarco before that. So my question to all the panelists is, can we genuinely say culture is moving in the right direction when we're still seeing these things? And how quickly do we think we can improve the culture so governance is at a standard where these things really are a legacy issue rather than a contemporary issue for the industry? I don't know who wants to juggle that grenade first.
The key, I think, is the reaction to these incidents rather than the incidents themselves. The accidents are always going to happen. There's no doubt about that. This is a dangerous, tough business where you're dealing with explosives. It's highly technical. We all know the issues around it. However, these incidents have occurred. And the key is how the companies have responded to them. They say that the measure of a person is how they deal with adversity. In this case, what we've got is the top three very senior executives getting fired from Rio Tinto as a result of the Juukan Gorge incident. We've seen massive changes within Vale as a result of this. And we've also seen a reaction from investors and other stakeholders as they have tried to rectify the paradigm around that wraps around these companies. So I do think culture is changing. It's changing for the better. It's perhaps happened a bit more slowly, but as we've seen now, with the sort of quite strict consequences that have occurred, particularly for the executives of Rio Tinto, I think we'll see an acceleration of that. Okay,
Evgeny, I'm probably looking from your perspective. I know Polymetal's got a very strong reputation, a very good track record. How have you seen your peer group moving with you or in step with you or catching up to some of the initiatives and some of the sustainability programs that you've got in place?
Three things I wanted to mention, just to maybe to comment on what Tal said about the accidents and tragic sort of loss of life that happened during the operations at mines. Definitely, it's how people react, which is more important rather than the fact that them themselves happen. We have mostly on the coattails of what happened at Samarco have taken a decision not to be built any more sort of wet tailing storage facilities. We decided to transition completely to dry stacking. So in all of our new mines that we're building TSFs with dry stacking. So there is not even the remote theoretical possibility of them failing. We are also in the process of actually replacing 2 of our sites storage facilities, which with dry stacking. So that's a reaction to what has happened, and I think it's something that is going to be taking place across the industry. Again, I'd like to repeat this cost of capital argument. The cost of capital is going to drive people to make these decisions. To your point on how fast the culture is changing, I think it depends on the point of view. For some of the people who've been in sort of the mining business or the finance world for a long time, like I've been doing this for over 20 years, the pace of change can be breathtaking. Although I think for a lot of activists who are on the other side of sort of demographics, it's probably too slow. And they would like to see a faster paced change. What I see around myself in our business is that the sustainability credentials are actually drawing people to the company. We have new young talents applying for jobs at Polymetal. One of the reasons they want to be a part of this story is actually these sort of sustainability credentials that we have. And that's something that we found to be a surprising and unexpected outcome of our drive towards a more sustainable future, is that the young people, let's not kid ourselves, the mining industry is not the sexiest sort of industry to be a part of. But some of the young people see that in us, and they apply for jobs at our industry. So we see opportunities, and we're quite happy that these sort of efforts and these investments into sustainability are paying off in such a way.
Okay. John, I've got a feeling you might argue that the industry is not sexy.
Well, I work at the World Gold Council, and we deal with gold in all its forms. So, sometimes it can be, but not my part of the business, sadly. So, direction of travel, I absolutely agree. We're moving in the direction of travel, in the right direction of travel. The question of speed, the question of destination is key. Certainly, the mining industry has been transformed over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of its agenda. Anybody who's been long in the tooth will know that if you had a sustainability issue to discuss and you were at a mining conference, you'd be on the last day when everybody had gone to the bar or left the country. That is not the case now. We are the whole issue in terms of what ESG means to investors and to miners, and how miners respond to ESG requests from their investors. I think that is center stage and front of mind now in terms of how CEOs understand their business going forward. The challenge, I guess, is the question of legacy risks and how quick the industry, and this is to do with timelines, how quick the industry can deal with risks that are in some ways legacy issues, or issues basically related to, embedded in the core operations. And so the conversation around tailings has obviously been key. The conversations around decarbonisation are key. How quickly can miners embrace change? I think, going back to the question of what might be sexy for younger people, is this an industry which is aligned with advanced technology, etc., etc.? I think the direction of travel is clear. The question really is one of pace and what speed we'll see in terms of that transition and transformation. So I'm fairly confident. I'm fairly confident in some of the issues we've discussed in terms of convergence in standards and a clarity forming in terms of how the business moves forward. But of course, it requires actions on behalf of the companies and the individual players. And that still, I think, remains to be seen. So your 2-year timeline is quite key. In 2 years, maybe we'll get to the point where that question will be a lot simpler to answer.
Okay, Georgina.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that these guys have said. Probably won't comment on the relative sexiness of metals, but I deal with base metals, so definitely can't compete with gold. Yeah, I think the biggest standout for me is that when we started the responsible sourcing work in 2017, we had to do a huge amount of work persuading people it was a good idea, and this wasn't the LME being massively ahead of everyone and overstepping its remit. And now, 3 years later, it's sort of well established, and we're getting, well, why hasn't this happened already kind of comments. So even in that 3 years, the debate has massively moved on. And I think the way the environmental emissions debate has accelerated over the course of the last 9 months to a year is the best example. That it's accelerating, and it's accelerating fast, and we're very quickly going to be out of date if we're not careful. So I do think the culture has changed. I think the pressure of the new generations coming in on a huge amount of culture, right? They want diversity and working from home, flexible hours, etc. They want wholesale change, and they're demanding it right now. So I do think that those of us who've been in the industry a little bit longer are going to have to work hard to make sure that we are continuing to evolve at that kind of pace. But it's a great opportunity, right? And COVID, as tragic as it's been, has accelerated some of that in a really positive way, and all these demands to build back better and for the world to do a better job of looking after each other and itself, I think is a massive opportunity for us that we need to take advantage of.
Thanks, Georgina. That is unfortunately all we have got time for today. It's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you everyone for joining us. Once again, we had Niels Wage, Evgeny Monikov, Georgina Hallett, Tal Lomnitzer, and John Mulligan. Thanks for your time, everyone.